Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful first day of December. It is my absolute pleasure to invite you into the last webinar convened by Rise Africa, and indeed the last of for this year, and indeed the last of the webinars for this year as part of the Building Sustainable African Cities During and After a Pandemic series. Our webinar is entitled Our Nature, Our Cities, a One Health Perspective on Urban Public Spaces. And it's brought to you by Rise Africa, as well as colleagues in our nature-based solutions workstream. My name is Paul Curry. I'm the manager of the Urban Systems unit. And with ICLEI, we're exploring how many different resources, systems, and people in growing African cities interact and can reinforce positive outcomes. We are joined by a very exciting panel today to explore One Health as one of these interconnected paradigms. And so One Health explores how human health, natural health, understood as animals, and nature are intertwined. Next slide, please. As mentioned, this is part of Rise Africa, which brings together thinkers, doers, and enablers to promote art, creative ways of expression, and other ways of knowing to inspire action for sustainable cities. And thus far, each month, we've had a specific intervention through food, localization of SDGs, futuring, mobility. November was focused on circular economy, and you can find the link to our latest mailer, which reflects on some of those ideas from last month. And this year, we're going to look into nature in our cities. Next slide, please. I am joined, and I welcome the panelists to turn on their video briefly so we can see you, by Ingrid Kutsia, a Senior Program Manager for Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions at ICLEI Africa, Anna Rocha, the Executive Director of Nipafagio in Tanzania, Mario Yanes, the Director of Inhabit Earth, Elizabeth Gitonga, the Program Manager for Partnerships at the Africa Early Childhood Network, and Catherine Ewing, Senior Lecturer and Convener of the Urban Design Program at UCT, and a Non-Executive Director of the Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading. And together we're going to explore how a One Health perspective might contribute to the way of thinking about public space in our cities, and what types of interventions we can use to welcome more nature into these public spaces and have strong environmental and social outcomes. I'd like to invite all of the attendees joining to put your name into the chat and introduce yourself and ask any questions into the chat or into the Q&A, and we shall address these when we get into our discussion section. So with that, I would like to invite Ingrid to open the conversation and to share her screen.
Thank you so much, Paul. And let me quickly do this share screen thing. There you are. I hope everybody can see my screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about the connection or the nexus between nature and health. And I'll do it through specifically focusing on the One Health approach and nature-based solutions. So I think that this year has been really a crazy year for everybody. And as we stand near the end of the year, I think we can all reflect back to the day that the world changed in the way that we certainly know it. Those of you who can't remember the date, I had to go and look it up. 11th of March this year, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic. And that heralded in a whole lot of changes, particularly the way that we relate and interact with friends and family, but also with nature, with the environment, with communities, and with cities. We were asked to stay at home. It was lockdown, and the lockdown circumstances differed from country to country, in some a whole lot more strenuous than others. And eventually, or not eventually, but what happened was that our streets were empty. There was nobody walking around, driving around, and we were literally locked up at home. And slowly things became a little bit different because we noticed that while we as people were locked up in our houses, nature was coming back into our cities. This particular photograph is not a video shopped photograph. It's a real one. It comes from St. Lucia. Those of you that know the St. Lucia area will know it's the site of a World Heritage Site, where the St. Lucia estuary. And there were hippos wandering around in the streets of St. Lucia at the time of lockdown. But there were also sightings of game and wildlife in many cities all over the world. And I'm sure you would have seen those pictures on the social media. But we also started slowly thinking, and people started talking about this, and many of the people started blaming and saying that, where did this pandemic come from? And then the stories about the wet markets in Wuhan in China came out, and people started thinking and blaming animals and saying that it was as a result of animals that the COVID pandemic arose and has spread so rapidly. However, the truth could not be furthest from this. And in fact, as you'll see from the quote here by Elizabeth Mrema, she's the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, she made it clear that nature is not to blame for the pandemic, but instead it is the interaction between people and nature that have created the circumstances for this to happen. And I think that we need to understand that the reality of the climate, biodiversity, and health crises are not only are they interconnected, but they are very much symptoms of how we interfere in our planetary systems, both the atmospheric systems, but also the natural, the ecosystems. And the important thing here is to understand that increasing human encroachment into wildlife habitats, many times, well, mostly driven by industries such as meat production, agriculture, infrastructure, logging, mining, deforestation, you can name it. These have led to increased interactions between people, wildlife, and this has resulted in the risk of disease spilling over from wildlife to humans. It's also driven land degradation, biodiversity loss, and jeopardized the ecosystem services, the goods and the services that we get from nature, depriving us of clean air, arable soils, clean water, and carbon sequestration. And I think the important thing to understand is that we need to recognize these interconnections, and we need to address the root causes of these encroachments and of the interaction. And to do that, we need to look at the link between nature and health. And in this diagrammatic representation, you can see that what it tries to show is that the root, the center, the trunk, as it were, is nature's biodiversity, the richness of species, both fauna and flora, and the ecosystems that result as a result of this. But the important thing about nature and ecosystem services is that it provides food and water security. It provides means and measures in which we can adapt to climate change, to disaster risk. It cleans our air, it cleans the water. It supports sustainable development. It supports our agriculture, our food security, our livelihoods. Nature is also a place where we can recreate, where we can recharge our batteries. So it has impacts on mental health and human well-being and all kinds of things. And I think what we need to understand also is that when we talk about nature-based solutions, and essentially nature-based solutions are based on the contributions or the goods that come from nature. So we need to just first step back a little bit and say, what is it that we get from nature besides the trees and the rivers and the mountains? And you'll see from the diagram on the left that essentially there are 4 types of ecosystem goods and services: the provisioning services, the cultural services, the regulating services, and the supporting services. Provisioning services include things like food and natural or raw materials. Regulating services are things that, such as flood attenuation as a result of wetlands or heat island effect due to greening and tree planting. Supporting services will include things such as basically habitats for species, the maintenance of genetic diversity, which is really important for us because it also supports our food economy and our food industry. as well as the cultural services, which is more recreational, and the spiritual experience that we get from being in nature. And if these things, if our ecosystems are healthy and they function properly, they can provide these services to us. And these services are free. They're not, you know, they're not owned by Google or by the World Bank or any company for that matter. And I think that the other thing that we need to understand is that if this is out of sync, and if there's a destruction or degradation of one or more, then we start getting negative impacts, and we no longer have clean air, clean water, etc. And then resultant health impacts start picking up. So if we look at nature-based solutions, which essentially come from nature and these ecosystem services, I think the important thing, and it's a really wide topic, it's quite, in some circles, it can be quite contentious also, because there are nature-based solutions that can be very detrimental to nature and to people for that matter. But essentially, nature-based solutions refers to the sustainable management and use of nature and of the sort of goods and services that we get from nature. And the important thing is that ultimately it's about taking action to protect and sustainably manage and restore natural ecosystems, or modified ecosystems for that matter, to address societal challenges. And these could be things like livelihoods, it could be climate adaptation, it could be health, human health, food security, disaster risk reduction, etc. And in order to be as a positive nature-based solution, it needs to be done in a way that will address these societal and environmental challenges in an effective and adaptive way, on the one hand, but on the other hand, also provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So we bring now into the picture the whole thing about One Health. One Health approach is not something new. It's been around for a while, and essentially it's been the main proponents are the World Health Organization, the FAO, and the CBD. And ultimately what it does, it seeks to achieve optimal human, animal, and ecosystem health by recognizing the intrinsic connections between all of these things. And you can see that very clearly from the diagram. There are a few drivers that serve as a challenge or a danger, and these would be, for example, when we have too much land use change and it leads to degradation, the overexploitation and destructive harvesting of species, invasive alien species, climate change, ocean acidification, etc. And ultimately, the One Health approach, as advocated by the World Health Organization, FAO, and the CBD, looks at trying to achieve better water and air quality, agricultural biodiversity and nutrition, managing infectious diseases, looking at traditional medicines, climate change, population, consumption, etc., etc. Now, up till now, and this has been around for at least 5 or 6 years, this approach, up till now, cities have not really featured in the One Health approach, and ICLEI plans to change that. We are in the process of what we call, or developing and establishing what we call a One Health city center. We will do this by partnering with various partners, by building on our existing partnerships as well. And ultimately, we want to make sure that the work that we do already in our existing biodiversity and food programs and initiatives can also come together and support the One Health approach. If anybody is interested in this One Health approach, and particularly the work that ICLEI is going to be doing, I would encourage you to either put your name in the chat box and just mark it for One Health approach. Alternatively, my email address is at the end of the presentation, and you could just then email me. And I think just to sort of bring it back to what cities can do and bring it back to nature, essentially what we need to do is, if we're looking to building back better and how we redesign our cities, we need to do that with nature. And we need to recognize that there are open spaces. Some of them are very natural, some of them are very degraded, but we need to bring nature back into them. Where it's, for example, on the left-hand side, it's a picture from a photograph from Cape Town, where you see an estuarine environment. It's a wetland. And that's a very important part of the environment. Not only does it have great recreational value for the city, but it's also important in terms of attenuating flood, protecting species. The beaches around that area are places where people, children can share and experience nature and learn, but also where they can just wind down and relax from nature. And if we build our cities and we redesign our cities with nature in mind, and nature actually is the driving direction, then it will serve to enhance the resilience and adaptive ability of our cities, and it'll improve the quality of life as well. Something else that I think that is important to understand is that we have green infrastructure and blue infrastructure in our cities, and we should optimize this. And it's not just for being aesthetic, for aesthetic purposes, but it could also address a range of urban issues. There's been some really interesting research done on the impacts of green infrastructure, for example, on reducing heat in cities. And where cities, given the climate change expectations, people are talking about between a 3 and 6 degree increase in urban temperatures. And there's been studies to show that these temperatures can be brought down considerably by having more trees, by having green roofs, by having open spaces that are green, whether you use the green for agricultural purposes or whatever, it doesn't matter. And I think that particularly in African cities where we have large areas of informality and many informal settlements, these green spaces are even more important because people don't necessarily have the access to and the ability to have private gardens. And another way is just seeing as how we are talking about food to bring nature back into cities is through agriculture. On the right-hand side, there's a picture of a very lively small-scale fishing harbor in Dar es Salaam, which is not only a major source of food for the locals, but it's also a huge tourist attraction. And it's an integral part of the life and the ecosystem of that city. But on the left-hand side, this comes from, I think it's either Moshi or Arusha, also Tanzania. And it's really interesting to see how they've used just open space in the city to plant vegetables and fruit trees, and people can access it. And these are ways in which one can address not only heat island effect, but also food security issues, livelihoods, etc. And Paul, with that, I'm going to say thank you. Asante, merci, enkosi. And there's my email address for anybody who's interested to know more about the One Health approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And what I often get from each of the presentations is a sort of one line that will stick in my head for a while. And I think here it's, they are not owned by Google, nature-based solutions. And I think a reason we have so much difficulty integrating nature into our cities from a pragmatic perspective is because comprehending the true value of nature is very difficult and very difficult to account for. I can't wait for someone to come, and say there's an app for that. But I think getting a proper sense of the value added to nature requires both a quantitative understanding, but also qualitative argument and a lot of advocacy, as you experience. So I think to take us further into that conversation, we're going to ask Anna Rocha to reflect on this with a grounded perspective from Dar es Salaam. Anna, if you can join us and share your screen.
Yes,
welcome.
I'm going to do it right now. Thank you. Oh, wait 1 second. Here we go. Can you all see my screen?
Perfect. Please proceed.
Okay. So I decided to start this presentation actually with a beautiful visual that was made by ICLEI, which is this map of Dar es Salaam, in which every single opportunity for nature to be present in the city is basically outlined here. So it's our city, our nature, our future. And I think we have this map here at the office, and everyone that comes by is always surprised and always engages with this map, because it shows a Dar es Salaam that we don't see here, obviously, and it shows a very diverse Dar es Salaam that we wish we could see here. So when you think about a city like Dar es Salaam specifically, you're thinking about a rapidly growing city. Dar es Salaam is predicted to have 10 million people before 2030. And it grows, the World Bank estimates that it grows about 1,000 people a day. And that comes with a lot of consequences to the city. One of the consequences being obviously the fact that the infrastructure and the services cannot grow at the same pace that the city needs it to grow. But there is also an unintended consequence here, which is the fact that as a lot of people migrate to Dar es Salaam, a lot of people don't feel ownership over Dar es Salaam and ownership over the land in Dar es Salaam. So when you think about public spaces and how to bring nature back into the city, it gets harder when people don't feel that the city belongs to them. And that's an unintended consequence of this growth that we have. And so you see things like that, which is Dar es Salaam during a flood. And that is a consequence exactly of like, there are many reasons for that. One of them being the fact that we actually have a lot of good regulations in terms of where people can and cannot build, where people should be living and where they shouldn't be living. They shouldn't be living 60 meters, they should be living at least 6 meters away from the riverbeds, for example. But none of this is properly implemented or managed because the city is not able basically to absorb the number of people that we have in growth at the pace that is needed. So you can see there's some of the numbers about what the floods bring to the city and also some of the money that is lost through that. And flooding is a very complex problem because it has a lot to do with, it has to do with solid waste management. It has to do with the fact that the soil is not able to absorb the water that comes from the rains because we may be paving too much. It comes from the fact that people are living too close and sometimes on the top of flood, like wet areas where they shouldn't be living. So all these consequences are based on mismanagement of the interaction between nature and people in the city. To name one thing here, one of the problems, and give some perspective on that one, river dumping is a very significant problem in Dar es Salaam. We have mapped over 2,000 dump sites along 8 rivers of Dar es Salaam, and over 1,300 of them are directly on the riverbeds. So that shows how there is a conflict in town about how people and nature are interacting. And that conflict is detrimental to people and is detrimental to nature as well. So just a couple more pictures. So one of the things that we try to do is basically show people that it doesn't need to be that way and engage, for example, students, because students and children are fundamental, so that if they understand how to interact better with nature in the city, they probably won't repeat the same mistakes that we have. This is we did an experiment at in some of the schools of Dar es Salaam. We have students building thermometers and then measuring the temperature that they have in an open area that has no trees, and then inside the classroom, and then in an area that is covered by trees. So basically they can see themselves what the nature benefits are when nature is available in the city or around their surroundings. These are some of the posters that I have done in that, and also to try to show people that you can actually have very small interventions, and those interventions can already bring some of the nature benefits that we're talking about earlier. So basically, the urbanization of Africa, if you think about big cities like Dar es Salaam, brings one of these challenges that we have been saying. And I think one of the things we have, this is an interview that was done to someone called Salim Ali, and he said the scale of environmental destruction in this city is very big. Even the patches that still appear green will soon disappear, because all the nature that is present here is somehow being used for construction or is somehow being misused. And so how to change that? Well, showing people what the benefits can be by having nature around. I think that's a very important thing to do, and allow people to basically experience that in a meaningful way. And having people also understanding that even if they don't come from Dar es Salaam, if they come from other areas in the country, they can still reclaim the public spaces of the city where they decided to live, because it's very important for them to own the city, to have public spaces that they can share with their families, with their communities, with their friends, so that their life is better, the life of everyone around them is better, and the city works better as well. So this is a little bit of what we would like to see here: more collaboration, more engagement, more presence, and more ownership of the spaces. So I think that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for contextualizing this. And I really like that you framed this around ownership. I think so many cities we experience this circular migration. People are following jobs. People are sending remittances back to a rural homeland, or sort of building a retirement home there. And so the question of how you create ownership and an urban identity, I think is really important. And I think your provocation at the end, that we have to claim that public space as a land use, as something which is vital and not to be used or covered or paved. Thanks so much. We're going to invite Mario Yanes to come and reflect on the concept of foodways in building ownership, I suppose, in one way, but connections with nature. Welcome, Mario.
Hi, thank you, Paul. Yeah, my work is about creating the conditions to inspire and enable the fullest potential of human nature. And so the idea of integrating nature, humans with nature, we are finding their own truest nature, right? In a common aim to regenerate both the land and the community. To me, regeneration means to simultaneously restore the land's capacity to create living soil, to create its own living soil, water, biodiversity, while creating the human capacity to thrive. So creating human systems that unfold gracefully into natural systems rather than overrun their ecological boundaries. So this, to me, begins with land use and how we live into the land in collaborative ways. And this is where our team at Inhabit Earth has developed this idea of foodways, a way of intervening to repair both urban environments and also repair our separation from each other and the natural world. So a foodway is intended to be a corridor of productive landscapes that are set up in ways that enhance the ecology of that space, whatever that space may be. And so it creates those conditions to restore or regenerate the soil, the urban forests, all the conditions you might see in a typical ecological restoration, at the same time while creating that same space in a productive way where you're growing food and growing all kinds of materials for basic needs, and then by virtue of this, creating livelihoods, meaningful livelihoods where people can engage in that regenerative process. We're testing this out now in Dodoma. We will be testing out Dodoma one project that we've done already is in the Bronx in New York, but I'll show you a picture. I'll show you some of our design plans as we begun to unfold this project. So we went through a process of mind mapping and detailing all the possible ways that we can intervene in this property in Dodoma that's owned by the municipality, and the property it's here. It's a good idea of the property is. It's in a part of the city where it's been development has been growing quite rapidly, and the idea is to begin to convert some of the land back to this kind of regenerative set of practices where we're creating an ecological buffer zone, at the same time creating ways to create livelihoods around productive activities. The design itself, I'll just go over briefly, has a very active center where there'll be all kinds of activities around growing vegetables and raising small animals, all the way out to orchards and grazing. It's a 4-hectare site. It'll include a farmer's market and a sort of more public space, a demonstration area around here, and also have an area dedicated to training beginning farmers with land that will be set up as an incubator farm. And of course, with a very, this is all very conceptual, so pardon the sort of the messy look of it, but and the idea is to have a very strong native buffer zone all the way around it to distinguish the boundaries and create habitat for beneficial insects and birds, etc. And once again, the idea is to bring back the capacity of this land, which even just by the look of it, you can tell it's been used in not so healthy ways, and it'll integrate the community around it and the community well beyond it in all sorts of ways, and it'll be a community-run project. So yeah, that's the idea. Then this is one location within the foodway that's planned over time, hopefully to intervene and once again become this buffer between natural areas and the development that's going on in most of our cities. And with that, I'll stop sharing. That's a little bit about the work that we are doing to intervene and create these kinds of opportunities for collaboration between people and natural systems. And once again, not as two separate entities, but really as humans discovering their truest nature, as ways of bringing us and onboarding humans to the rest of the natural world. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mario. Yep. And I think that speaks to this point again with One Health as an integrated approach, which is, it's not about one aspect of this concept for another, it's doing it together. And I think that's what's quite exciting about the work going on in foodways. And then I think a key word you mentioned there is soil, which has now emerged very strongly in some of the conversations we're having around circular economy in African cities, and regenerating soils as a vital component to that.
Yeah, so, I like to say that the soil is the limit. We can do lots of things, but that's it.
But not if we don't look after our soils. Yeah.
Right on.
Great. Thank you so much for the inputs. So I think we've heard 3 very strong inputs sort of through a nature perspective to start, and we're going to change tack a little bit and hear from Elizabeth Gitonga on the role of early childhood development in our cities. Welcome, Elizabeth. Great to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Glad to be here. And I'll share my screen. I am with the Early Africa Early Childhood Network, And yes, you know, looking at this from a different lens, really, looking at what does this portend for early childhood as we think about the urban cities. Let me just get that off. And what does early childhood development look like in African cities? And I think one of the things that's worth considering very significantly as we think of the cities is the significance of the early years. And we can see from that graphic there that you know, a child's brain develops, 90% of it develops before age 5. And so the child's early experiences in life will have lasting effects and contribute to the chances of good health and success, just based on the experiences that they will have in those very early years, because it is in these years that the foundational architecture is put in place for the child's brain. And so the immediate surroundings are very significant in determining what that architecture is looking like, because when we look at research from brain imaging, it does suggest that children growing up in disadvantaged environments will have a different brain development. For example, if there's a lot of chaos and poverty that's causing stress to the brain systems, then this makes the child very vulnerable to chronic diseases later in life. But even though this seems very bleak, the good part of it, or you know, the way we can look at this positively is that, you know, this is information that is available and is known. So we are at a position where we can do something about it in the way we plan. This graph just shows just the significance of those early years, and we can see that the sensory pathways and the language, you know, there's a really steep path of growth in those very early years, and even the beginning of higher cognitive function, which of course advances a lot more as the child is growing. So in those early years, there's a lot of proliferation, and more than 1 million new neuron connections are happening every second, actually. So by the time they are 5 years old, a lot of those neural connections have already been established, and there's a pruning process also happening at the same time, where then what is not being used, what is not useful to the child, is pruned off. So it is that we want that the circuits that are established at that time are going to be strong, so that there is a strong foundational architecture in the development of the child's brain, and therefore speaking into his potential going forward. So, you know, when we think of, you know, how then do we, what are those critical factors that will ensure that we have that well set up and we have the adequate environment for the child? And we may have heard of the Nurturing Care Framework. This was put out by WHO, and it was a framework for helping children survive and thrive to transform health and human potential. And there are 5 key components, each of which are critical to think about as we are thinking of early childhood. And even just to mention here that often when we speak of early childhood, people tend to think of early learning, you know, the early learning centers, the play groups, and that kind of a thing. But really, we are talking about the whole child, and what the whole child needs is therefore then the development in early childhood. And as the graphic shows, you know, there is a safety and security that's critical, because children do need safe and secure environments for themselves and for their families. Children need the opportunities for early learning, and this is not confined to what happens within a formal school setting, but really any opportunity for the baby, toddler, or child to interact with people, to interact with objects in the environment, to interact in the environment itself. So just that opportunity for early learning that really actually happens from birth and even before birth, because when a baby is in utero, they are still receiving signals from the outside world and appreciating the music and the sounds they hear, or equally, those can also be a factor of stress to the child in utero. The child also requires good health. and not just the child, but also the health and well-being of the caregiver also is critical, so that they are also healthy enough to take care of the children, and adequate nutrition. And especially in those early years, it's critical that both the child and the mother have adequate nutrition. When the child is still in the womb, it's important for the mother to have adequate nutrition so that the child grows up in the womb strong and healthy. And after the child is born, the mother would be breastfeeding that child where possible, and she does need that adequate nutrition. And the responsive caregiving being the fifth element, which really undergirds all these four, because it is that ability of the parent or caregiver to notice, understand, and respond to a child's signals in a timely and appropriate manner. You know, all the cues that the child gives when the child is looking at the parent or caregiver, or the stimulation that the parent and caregiver can give to that child, so that they're responding to stimuli around them. And that goes a long way in creating that strong circuit, those strong neural pathways through learned behavior and continuous responses. But, you know, when we look at data about early childhood, sometimes, you know, often it is contrasted. What is it like for a rural child? What is it like for an urban child? And obviously, you know, the outcomes are usually favorable for the urban child, because there's a lot more supporting services and facilities, and you know, a nurturing environment for the child in the urban areas where there's heavy investment. But, you know, crowded or what may be shadowed in that kind of data is that this is an aggregate data. So when we think that the urban child could be better off than the rural child, you know, it is clear for all of us. I would imagine we've been to the cities and seen that the cities are not homogeneous. And it could be that the child living in the areas where there are slums and low-income settlements is actually a lot worse off than that child in the rural areas. Data shows us that 6 in 10 Africans who live in urban areas reside in slums. And this picture just kind of depicts this, and we see this a lot in the developing world, you know, where you just have that stark difference between a well-developed urban settlement, which has all the social amenities for the children growing up here, you know, good lighting, good ventilation. You can see a lot of greenery around, and, you know, there is probably a playground, and you can see every house has a little play area, and perhaps even to put up a kitchen garden, and just divided by, you know, barely any mileage, really, barely a foot, just a foot out is a slum settlement where you hardly see any green spaces, very tightly knit houses. And I would imagine that even the people per unit, the number of people in every unit, would be a lot less than, you know, in the more developed area. So just to say that the statistics sometimes really do need to be disaggregated to really know what is it like really on the ground for all the children, and not just an average, which may not give the true picture of what's happening, especially for the very young and vulnerable. So I like this quote by Patrin Watanatada from the Bernard Van Leer, who are doing great work with urban spaces in early childhood development. And this is a question: if you could experience a city from an elevation of 95 centimeters, the height of a 3-year-old, what would you do differently? And that's a really, it's really well phrased when you think of the elevation, because that's what planners think about, you know, what's the elevation? How do you make use of this terrain? But, you know, having that perspective of a 3-year-old, and what would we do differently if we put ourselves in the shoes of that young child? And when we think of that young child, you know, when we're talking of early childhood, we really are talking of children 5 years and below, in some contexts 8 years and below. And you'll find that even where people have been intentional about planning child-friendly kind of urban planning or, you know, space planning, these little ones, 0 to 3, are often invisible and forgotten. And you may find that the needs of perhaps the school-going children, 6 and above, are taken into consideration, but the little ones could very easily get forgotten. They're really so tiny and apparently voiceless, but definitely not voiceless. And, you know, they need everything that any other child would need. You know, well-ventilated, good lighting, adequate room for movement. At this age, they are crawling and they need that room for movement within their natural setting. And, you know, we are thinking about these children who are spending almost 100% of their time in those very early years in the household, in the house, or just within the neighborhood. They need well-designed, their spaces should be well-designed so that they are easily accessible, that people and their parents can easily get out and go to work and easily come back in without having very long and tiring commutes and having to walk through very difficult terrain. Free of pollution, and we know the risks of pollution to young children whose lungs are a lot less developed than the adult children are, adults are. So even where there's pollution, the risk is a lot more to the small children than to even the older ones or adults. You know, secure place where there is no risk from the elements, you know, the flooding and the kind of misfortunes that we see happening where houses and settlements are not constructed with those safety measures in place. Solid architecture, access to early childhood services like sanitation, healthcare, or housing, family friendly, you know, just how many people are packed in one room. And it is amazing to know how many people live in those very tiny, very, very tiny rooms. So, you know, putting that in mind, what is the adequate space for young children? And, you know, we've had a lot from the previous presenters, but, you know, that whole idea of being green and efficient is critical and will play a significant role even going forward as we are thinking of restoring and making spaces that are safe, even where we may need a little more distance in the face of a pandemic like we are in. So, you know, how do we make use of the natural resources around us? How do we construct places, for example, with rainwater catchment and storage system to ensure that there is water and sanitation and hygiene, which of course is very paramount for the health of every young child. Collective spaces for play. Security of tenure is a big deal because we know that in informal settlements, there's no security of tenure, and over, you'd hardly find anybody who's been in one place, in one home for, you know, for 20 years. There's evictions. If it is not the elements of the weather, it is the elements of the society and government not having any security of tenure and living with that constant fear that you could lose this property anytime. And that creates a lot of stress. And that stress, of course, will not be helpful in bringing up children who are happy and safe and who are thriving. So having that security of tenure is important. And of course, access to markets so that they can get fresh food. And these are just some of the things that we would think about. And there are lots more even coming from the discussions that have happened and even as we look around us. So just thinking about what then must we do, even as we are thinking about these children in the urban cities in Africa. There are lots of treaties that actually do uphold the rights of the children. For example, the Africa Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And it is important to hold governments accountable because they have ratified these treaties. That means they have given a commitment that we are going to put in place measures, legislation, policies that will protect these rights, that will ensure that these rights are realized. So holding governments accountable to those, and that would include that they then need to budget for these rights to be realities in terms of their realization. There's also a need for data. There is a data gap in just understanding all these different aspects that we're talking about in the African context and looking at, you know, what's the impact of some of the situations that we are living with in the urban areas, and also what is going to be the best way forward. There are great examples, model cities that we're talking about, and others happening in other areas in the world, and just having data to then look at what does this look like in a city in Africa, because every context has its unique aspects.
Elizabeth, to please wrap in the next minute. Thanks so much.
Yes, sure. So yeah, having a specific focus on the welfare of the child and just ensuring that we're thinking about the child 0 to 3 or conception to 3. Collaborative action, include everybody in that. Any stakeholder involved the child, let them be part of that process. And let's include the child in urban planning. And I think this is one that I'll just end with in saying that we must listen to the child and watch them closely, because they do speak, and we want to include them in our decisions, and we want to hear their voice. And they may not speak through words, but they speak also in their actions. A careful observation of the child and a careful reflection on the nature of the child, which is guided by God, their creator, will equip us to know what is best for the child. So just having these things in mind, and of course, advocacy, just helping parents know what's important so that they too can echo that message and demand for the right services. These are some of the 6 steps you could take, and definitely there are more, but just wanting to highlight these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I really like the last 2 slides of recommendations, both for what public space and homes need to look like, and very much what we can do. And I think a lot of the themes then about sort of ownership and pride in space have come through there, as well as how environments do shape us very strongly. Thanks so much. Before we turn to our last input from Catherine, I just know Mario has to leave us on the hour. And there was a really interesting question put in by Nick into the question and answer. And I wonder if Mario might just reflect on that so everyone can hear the answer. We regenerate land through nature-based solutions, but how do you regenerate communities? Can you name community-based solutions? And are there strategies or examples? I wonder, Mario, if you could reflect briefly on that before we hand over to Catherine.
Yes, I'd love to. Thanks. Yeah, I believe that we do this by generating livelihoods, and this means in a very real and economic way, tying the wellness of human communities to the wellness of the land. And so the idea is to make that very visible, to make that a very conscious effort. Yeah, and then we grow the materials, the food that we need as human communities, while creating regenerative landscapes, ecological regeneration, and then that community, the wellness of the community and the wellness of the land is one and the same. And so the idea of being able to grow things directly and make things with our hands with things that we grow directly is an essential way of both revitalizing community, which has broken down substantially, and revitalizing our membership in the larger community of life, that is the natural world. And so that's a little bit of where that comes from. I think answering that question.
Thanks so much. I see Anna has indicated she'd like to respond to this as well. So maybe we take that one input and then we return to Catherine.
Yeah, just one comment on that, because yesterday specifically I was in an engagement with several organizations, environmental organizations, and we were talking exactly about that. So I find these questions very interesting because it does push us. I think sometimes we name things and we talk about them based on the environmental benefits. But sometimes it's harder for people to relate to that, although we understand the connection between nature, people, and all. Sometimes like regular people do not think the same way. And in this discussion that I was yesterday, there was a whole conversation about how we can basically talk about climate, nature, basically all these themes without necessarily naming them based on environment, but naming them based on the social benefits. So that's just my comments.
And I'd like to say one more brief thing. What Elizabeth was talking about is true for even doing this kind of work with foodways, et cetera. It becomes really reaching your inner child as an adult. And that's a whole other way of looking at things, but it's a really fun way to create community, to regenerate. You know, as adults, we think too much. And so the idea, seriously, and the idea of, you know, coming back to our true natures and finding our ways to see as children see, or, you know, or as nature sees, maybe, is something way deeper. So it's, I mean, probably a whole other topic, but wanted to throw that in as a connection to a lot of what's being said.
I can't wait for us to leap into the conversation, but we'll pause here, and I think there are a few hooks to come back to on community regeneration and maybe this idea of gamification, making it fun to improve our nature and public space. But we'll pause for our last intervention, and I think Catherine can take these themes further with reflections from VPU and beyond.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be able to share some thoughts. I'm going to try through this presentation, because I'm the last one, to pull together a few threads, but it might be quite hard to start linking everything together. But the community projects and potentially linked to early childhood development and this idea of growing become very important in the work that I've done. So the work that I'm presenting today is my sort of last 20 years of sort of research, teaching, and also practice, and the practice from the Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading program, but also a lot to do with my current teaching and what I'm doing in the urban design program at the University of Cape Town. So I think what I have found in many of the areas that I've worked in is this whole idea of safe city becomes so much more about the quality of life. And that is a combination between green and natural, and between lighting, and between spaces where children can go. But I think where public spaces are key to plural and peaceful communities, avoiding stigmatizing social groups. And that really kind of spoke really strongly to me from the new urban agenda in 2016. To leave no one behind, to create quality public spaces that are participatory, peaceful, and create inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable spaces. And most importantly, to live without violence, particularly for that of a child. So we have, for many instances, the concept of public space is exactly this image for me, where there is a slide and a jungle gym. But if you are a mother and you know your child goes to the top of that slide, it is probably one of the most unsafe spaces you've probably ever been in your life. But I do think that these are the public spaces that don't necessarily speak to our African cities. And when we create them, they become almost unsafe spaces. This is more the reality that I've spent a lot of my working career in. And it's almost like where one lands off grid. So it is at this intersection of the ordinary and the extraordinary lives that people live on an everyday basis. And as Harrison and Zach put it, a complex patterning of socio-spatial change after apartheid. So these are the images of this is where people collect water, a public space. It's a public space where you have to share water, share bathroom facilities, and a space in which children find themselves more often than not. These are the kind of ecosystems that we have in central Cape Town, in Gugulethu. This is the main canal system running through. And this is current, this is 2020 when I took this photograph. So my students and I, we've been mapping these areas and the impact on the quality of life of residents. So I almost put it into a reframing of what is safe public space in African cities. So I see these as we need to deeply question the public realm, and that is in our context of emerging spaces of exchange. And when I speak of spaces of exchange, I'll explain that a bit more when I go through my presentation. I also think we're in a space of new centralities. So we are reimagining a new stage for urban life. And I find that really dynamic and exciting. So spaces that are more relevant to everyday life in Africa. It's also about the intersection of people and place. And I think that has come through a lot through the previous presentations. And place, whatever that may be, and in whichever country we land ourselves. I also talk a lot about changing shadows. So this fast and rapid change we're experiencing in many of our cities. And the community representative I've been working with, she explains it as her everyday culture. So I almost translate that into everyday practice. So I'm going to list just 4 stages of what I consider public life or public space. The first one is urban streets. And in many instances, it's about where we can start creating safe walkways, and we reimagine public streets as our new edges. So it's not only about what moves down the street, but it's very much about what happens at the threshold, at the interface. There's eyes, so eyes on the street, feet on the street. So we get a lot of opportunity. Threshold, we have landscaping happening. So a far more environment where we can go to. A project from the Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading program in Lotus Park, and the collaboration with Imandla Edu Football, where we managed to create a very dynamic space at night. And these are sometimes we always never consider what actually happens at night to create quite a safe space, or a changed space, should I say. The next area that I look at is often this idea of livelihood. So public space as a livelihood, rather than the jungle gym in the center. So we've been mapping where a lot of the spaza shops are located, and often these are our safer spaces, predominantly in informal settlements. They also have certain elements of 24/7 kind of notions. So it's about this idea of building on local knowledge and questioning what is housing and how can we actually create more appropriate housing in our environment. This was a little project I worked on back in 2014, but I still go back to it because the spaza shop in the background was absolutely fundamental to actually how the functioning of this space actually happens, and an early childhood development program that runs in this space actually act as our eyes on the street, but also they store their equipment in the spaza shop, and there's kind of a mutual exchange and sharing of public space that then becomes a different kind of public space. I'm not going to explain the whole kind of background to it, but it's this notion of the spaza shop has so much more to it. Education. And I think we touched on this briefly, but I want to touch on it in terms of a space where early childhood development centers have become the new focus in the neighborhood. So they become our new public realm. And they are always full of happy tunes, and but yet they are also still fully laden with complexities and difficulties. We did a project in 2017 with Fundament Design, where they changed a public space, an open space, a leftover space full of dumping, into something that was a movie night on a Friday night. And we had so many children attending, and at the same time we managed to put in some lights and upgrade a walkway. So it's this idea of knock-off effects or small change, big impact, that actually public space has so much potential in reaching that element. And then the last sort of theme that I look at or frame is one of the urban gardens, where it's shifting the idea of the production of land at the micro scale. This is a gardening project that started in about 2017 in Monobisi Park Informal Settlement in Cape Town, where there was a direct relationship with the household on the one edge, and actually behind this is a sports field and an early childhood center. So the relationship between those becomes even stronger, where the caretaker actually becomes a guardian of not only the gardens, but a much bigger community sort of precinct at a spatial level, as well as bringing in a livelihood and an economy to the community. So just 4 lessons from that. So it's revealing the small spaces in our city, and particularly looking at areas of new mechanism for governance, partnership and financing. Radical change to zoning. So we actually can look at public space as something different, and not the little playground that is always referred to, or the park, or the botanical garden, but that needs a lot of trade-offs. And then also this idea of reinvestment in the memory of space, but also creating practical, strategic and transformative projects through that process. And then lastly, and I think this came up just now, is this idea of scale of agency and room for engagement. So creating that opportunity for engagement in the idea of a co-productive environment where there is responsible and active participation, and not purely just the expectation from one group or one organization to conduct that work. And just, I suppose in leaving you, or in summary, I think it's also this idea of knowledge exchange and taking the teaching into these spaces where students can engage and learn about these spaces in a very different way that allows for the reimagination or the reimagining of public spaces as one that is around interdisciplinary research. And it goes beyond the design of a public space, but it includes the management, operations, as well as the kind of the everyday life that happens in them. And I think that's all from me.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And I think, the central provocation, there is for us to rethink what our public space is. And I think you presented these really nice ideas about how we look at the in-between spaces and not stick with a sort of hallmark of a playground. And I think the reflection as a mother of are they actually safe, and your own concern there. But the 4 points of emerging spaces of exchange, new centrality, moving edges, and changing shadows certainly caught my imagination. I'd like to invite all our panelists to turn on the videos and in the last 20 minutes of our conversation, just to reflect on a few things together. Please, if there are any participants who would like to ask a specific question, throw it in the chat so that I can forward it on. Otherwise, you'll be subject to some of my responses. And panelists, please also, if there's something you'd like to add more to. I think my first question is in that response of the question of aspiration. And we, as change agents looking for sustainability and looking at these rapidly growing cities, are not really dealing with overconsumption or huge impact of the present only, but about what will happen as people, as our growing middle class expands, and what people's expectations of consumptive lifestyles will become. So similarly, how do we reshape what aspirations people have, or what understanding or expectations people have on their public space? And I think if I can redirect that to Catherine and then to Elizabeth, there was a thought from a colleague of mine saying, well, if children are going to an early childhood center in their settlement, and it's in a rundown building, is that setting the conditions for their expectations of what they can achieve? And so how do we reshape these spaces to, I suppose, build aspirations that take them further and that help them to reimagine that space?
Well, I think maybe one has to almost turn it the other way around and ask the community members themselves kind of what those aspirations are. So that one image I showed of the where the children are playing in that space, It was very much a project that came from a multitude of workshops and engagement with trying to understand the certain conditions and the context in which people are living their daily lives and in which context children are being educated. And we found that it was in a public space where everybody came together. And it was the opportunity to actually say, well, maybe these are spaces in which we could have a more neutral approach. And I know neutral is a very difficult concept in areas that have very little resources. But what we had also found out was that many children were not accessing even a small ECD in some settlements we were working in. So there was absolutely no access to any education. But yet the children were always around a water tap. And so a project grew out of that was called Imtonjeni, where there were numerous role players, numerous collaborators who came into that platform, and we worked on with a community-based organization in creating a space for children to actually, a space to learn, but also to be respected. It's a complicated question of how you deal with aspirations, but that's just one very small project in which I have been involved. But it takes a level of trust from many people, but also that idea of active participation. So everybody has to come to the table, and everybody has to have a role to play within that.
And I totally agree with what you're saying, Catherine. Growing the imagination of the people in they themselves also then saying this is the kind of space that we would like. And one of the things that I would say is, even just helping the community imagine what it would be like. And that comes from, when I think of like ECD centers, sometimes there's a typical kind of image that a community may have on what does a child need for early learning. But how about we break down those barriers and we begin reinventing that and begin seeing, so what does that look like? Is that necessarily a center with 3 classrooms? Could it be a hall where we have different things happening, different learning centers happening in a big hall because we do not have 3 classrooms? What are the learning opportunities within our community that are outside of the bounds of the classroom? And how can we make these spaces safe and friendly for children to interact in this environment? So I would say even just, defining, allowing a redefinition of what does the child need, and closely examining what we know typically to be the services that have been given, and seeing, what is appropriate for this community given the resources that are at hand.
Thanks. And framing that on helping communities to imagine, maybe your reflections of this, Anna. You've been working in sort of community engagement in Dar es Salaam around these ideas for a while. Have you seen a shift in how people relate to the environment? You noted that sometimes we mustn't use the word environment, and people must find their own definitions in that.
Yes, so I totally agree with both Elizabeth and Catherine just said about the importance of actually having the community voicing and understanding what they want. In addition to that, I think there is also a need to show some possibilities. Because one of the things that happens sometimes here in Dar es Salaam is that as people didn't grow up with lots of public spaces that they could enjoy, sometimes they don't know what the possibilities are. And so there is definitely a shifting mindset when people are exposed to different ways of using the space when they have an opportunity to do so. And there is also, even when something new, like we put something new, we are right now building several materials recovery facilities that are attached to living areas for kids, for adults, and everything. And it's also very interesting to see how people take those spaces over once those spaces are available in their communities. And then their mindsets, yes, it runs towards, okay, I can actually, that's allowed, I can do this, even if it's a space that has an owner, although the spaces that they're building belong to the community, but they see that as having an owner because there is someone supervising it, I am allowed to use those spaces. These spaces can be mine, and then how can I interact with nature in a different way using those spaces?
Thanks. And Ingrid, you wanted to add something?
I want to come in here. I mean, just listening to all these amazing ideas and examples of what's happened reminds me of something that I was very fortunate to experience. I think it was last year or the year before. No, it was the year before. I went to Medellin, and Medellin was the gang capital of the world at some stage. There were horrendous gangs, and it was obviously drug lords, etc. It was a city that was under siege, effectively. And it got to a point where there was a new mayor, the umpteenth one that was elected. They normally didn't last very long because they would be shot or they would be, they would become gang leaders themselves. But what ultimately happened was that they embarked on a process of reimagining the city around the walls, what they called the visible and the invisible walls. And a lot of what you are telling us now reminded me of the story that they ultimately, what they did was they realized that the state came in and there was a lot of controversy around that, but the army came in and they had to sort of destabilize the situation. And then the city, the mayor, who was a champion for trying to get his community rebuilt, basically took over. And to sort of cut a very long story short, what they did was to combine the sort of social, cultural, economic access issues on the one hand with providing, the city invested in infrastructure. So some of the visible walls were around the way that the city is built, and the people that were living in the sort of the slum areas and the gang infested areas didn't have access to the other parts of the city where there were schools, where there were parks, where there were public amenities, etc. So what they did was they built a transport system to connect the city, and they built even up to, it's a very steep city. It's literally on two sides of a mountain, and there's a thin valley at the bottom where there's a river, and the main sort of CBD is located. And they built a monorail, and they put in escalators to help the people get up easily so that they could get access into the city where they could get better jobs, etc. And then what they also did was they had programs to help the people understand what it was that this gang lifestyle had created for them and how it had created division. On the one side, people that were scared; on the other side, people that were sort of the sort of warlords or the gang lords. So there was the social, cultural programs of dialogue, understanding the differences. At the same time, they looked at where the public amenities were. And through a process of co-production, what they did was, instead of having the public health and ECD centers located maybe in the main areas of town, they created smaller areas under the public transport access. And so those areas also became places not only where the clinic, the nursery school, and the local sort of library is, but also where you could have a public, you could have a food garden. And it's created an incredible city. There's still huge problems with gangs and crime, etc. But the city is far more integrated culturally, economically, physically, and nature and art played a huge role in this. And today it's part of the tourism attraction of the city. And I think it's a really great story of how the city administration, political leaders, the community leaders, ordinary people, educationalists, business people, all came together and reimagined the city by firstly breaking down the visible and invisible walls and then creating a new city. Thanks.
Thanks, Ingrid. And I mean, I think learning, you know, as a central aspect of that was really important as well, sort of privileging, I think, the public library in the middle of the city. So I don't know, Catherine, if this reigns true with a concept of new centrality. I still need to digest a little bit. But I think we have a teeny bias at ICLEI with our members being local governments. So perhaps if we can each go around and reflect on today's discussion, you know, and you've each given recommendations. So with the risk of being redundant, to ask, you know, what is one key action that you think local government could take around improving public space for people and nature? And I think we can close that way. Catherine.
A lot of the work that I have done is being directly in partnership with local municipalities, so and with local communities. So I never see it as a separate thing where one person has to do one thing. And I always see it, I've always worked in very interdisciplinary platforms, working beyond just my spatial discipline, but also working with the economy. I mean, livelihood is a big thing for many households in South Africa at the moment, and even more so during the COVID landscape. So I do think it's a redefining of what is public space, and I've recently had to review our public space regulation and guidelines, and I was absolutely horrified to actually realize how restrictive it is. And I feel that redefining, and I can say that because I'm sitting in an academic research platform, but you know, the reality, I know that also from practice and implementing anything on the ground is near impossible when it comes to certain things. And I think Anna may have said that there was very good regulations in Dar es Salaam. I mean, we in South Africa have very good kind of policy guidelines, but actually implementing some of them also become absolutely impossible. So I think there's a mismatch between the policy kind of practice domain, and then research often gets to sit on the side, whereas I always see it as a kind of a more integrated approach. And it's all kind of hands on deck, small change, big impact. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I could carry on, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. Anna?
So in Brazil, there is actually a regulation that says that all land, all buildings, all constructions need to serve a social purpose. So for example, if I have a piece of land, but it's abandoned, I am not using, the government has the right to take the land away from me and repurpose that land. It's very beautiful when you say that, doesn't work that well, but that's something that I wish was more of the way that people see the use of land here in Dar es Salaam, here in Tanzania, and everywhere in the world, as, okay, I have a piece of land, but that doesn't belong to me, because the land, like, I'm just using that land, I have the right to use it, and belongs to the planet, which means that I need to do something meaningful with it. And that goes with the use of land, use of spaces, and the reclaiming the spaces. So that would be one of my aspirations on how we could bring basically communities to think about land.
Thanks. Ingrid?
Paul, I think it's about partnerships between cities and the people that live and work in the cities, whether it's an individual or a community or a business enterprise. It's about working together and co-designing or co-imagining what a new, what a better city would be, in order to reconnect people, and using the open spaces that we have in our cities to do just that, whether it is for food gardens, or whether it is to plant these little mini forests, or restore a wetland. I don't think that matters, but I think it's also important that we understand that every local contribution or local action actually can ultimately have global impact. So it's remembering that those little actions, those little projects those little sort of interventions can cumulatively actually have much greater impact, firstly on the city and then globally as well.
Great. And Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I have to agree with everything. I love those recommendations. If there's one phrase I will come out with today is small change, big impact. And that really is so significant, even in thinking, what would I tell the government? This is priority. And really just that whole idea of public spaces. When I think of our city, Nairobi, where I am, where we do have that protected public space, you see droves of families going there to, for their recreation. And just that template of what more could we add into this public space that we have already provided access. What if there was a library? What if there was a health center? Just thinking about those social amenities that could then even make that public space that much more useful to the community. So protecting those spaces, growing those spaces, and even having more of those kind of spaces and access for them. I love what you shared, Ingrid, just places that are locked off, breaking down those that then more and more families can begin to enjoy these spaces. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. I think this has been a really inspiring conversation to help guide, and I think there are a lot of key ideas to take forward. So I would like to just offer sincere thanks to our speakers for the insights shared, and to our participants for attention and sharing of questions. I think if I were to offer a summary point, which might be risky, I think it's about re-understanding what public space is, and in this way seeing it as these intermediate spaces, not only as a central protected space, but where it is protected, as Elizabeth has just said, supporting its use. But we can protect public space by using it, and Anna has given that provocation. And so by claiming it, and that point of making sure that it has social purpose, and so seeing what already exists and allowing new imaginaries to come in through collaboration, and understanding how things are already used, I think is a central lesson for me. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the last webinar as part of ICLEI's Building Sustainable Communities through during and after a pandemic, as well as the last webinar this year for Rise Africa. We'll be putting out an open call for sessions likely at the beginning of the year to engage further ideas as part of Rise Africa. And we look forward to hearing your ideas into the new year. Everyone, please do enjoy the day further, and hope to see you anon.